Turn it on. Okay.
So let me throw it out to you guys. I mean, I didn't know there was an hour, so it's like I don't know about you. I've got anxiety, depression. I've suffered all my life, and I have this insatiable need to make sure I don't waste your time. And so I put together a presentation that's kind of an adaptation of something else. It's got a lot of slides to it, but I think it has some cool parts in it. But it was just a way to convey some thinking. I don't want it to be pedantic though. I prefer to make sure that we talk and that you guys get some value out of this time together. So I'll leave it up to you. Do you want me to launch into this thing, or do you want to just talk and go through, ideas about background, different areas of thinking? What do you think?
I would be curious to hear how you got into what you're doing now.
Okay, cool. And let me know if you want me to go through this presentation. It's got a lot of pieces to it. I can always send it to Pat, and he can share it with you. Just
Yeah,
as
I definitely like to be able to look at it
okay.
at least. But yeah.
Good. Well, so I'm a Virginia native kid who played outside kind of thing. Didn't have a clear path. Undergrad, I actually was a history major with a biology minor. We didn't have restoration ecology back then. And so I went in the military. So I was a RTC at William and Mary, went active duty, served overseas, and, got a good feeling for how that side of life works. And in the process of thinking about what to do, whether to stay in the military or not, I had a pretty clear understanding I wanted to go to what I thought was the environmental field. So, when and this is 1992 after the Gulf War, and everything's transitioning. So I got out of them. I actually ended up meeting my ex-wife at the time, and got out, and she was the one with the paying job and the benefits. So I took whatever work I could get, and it was included, like 3 or 4 jobs at one time. My first position in this field was actually as a seasonal naturalist working at Potomac Overlook Nature Center in Arlington, Virginia, which ironically opened when I was a kid. And I was, my mom took us there. So it was one of those things where you kind of go back to your roots. What was really good about that, though, is I kind of began to understand at a grassroots level what local conservation looks like. But also, I will say flat out, I thought I had good communication skills, but I learned pretty quickly that when you have to do environmental education to very varied age groups, including kids in diapers kind of thing, you learn quickly that you need better skills. And I will say this, that I feel that my path has been one where I have delved into a lot of different areas of restoration. But I have found that being able to communicate has been so important, and that's a core skill I was fortunate enough to kind of hone early. So what I ended up doing was I had the seasonal position. I know I needed it for more education. And actually, the military had paid me when I was an undergrad, had paid for my GRE. So I went back to George Mason and got admitted to their graduate program. And I went back in their environmental science program, and ended up being the right path for me because I was married, working, working full time, going to school at night, kind of thing. And we had 2 kids along the way while I'm wanting to get my master's degree. So it's kind of that classic thing where life is busy. And I will say this, that while I was working on my master's in environmental science, I ended up getting a position with Northern Virginia Regional Park Authority that was very different. It was a position that focused on what they call permits and planning and land use. So what I ended up doing was I was regulating people wanting to do things on parkland, and they had about 7,000 acres at the time. And what I ended up becoming was, for them, there was an oil spill in Reston in 1993. 400,000 gallons of fuel oil spilled into a creek behind Reston Hospital, and one of the regional parks became the recovery site. So they didn't have anybody to do anything about it. So I became the oil spill project officer. And in the process, I learned about, using bacteria to degrade long chain carbons and soil profiles, doing bioassays of creeks that had been blitzed, as well as the tributaries that had not been blitzed, learning how to do damage assessments, and using the International Society of Arboriculture assessment protocols to look at tree impacts, but also assess damage packages for recovery to the park system, and then implementing restoration planting and things like that. So talk about a going in full bore up to your armpits in a new area. I was interacting with, at the time, Dave Paler, who later became the director of the Department of Environmental Quality for Virginia, was on our project team, along with Rick Bush and these other people that, just at the time, I didn't know who the heck they were. But I think by taking the opportunity and being willing to jump in with both feet, I met a whole bunch of people that, I was able to learn from, but also were interesting contacts and contextually going forward. The other thing was I learned very quickly to interact with the person, the company that was perceived as the violator, Colonial Pipeline Company. Um, they actually, some contractor was actually working and damaged their pipeline. And you would look at a fuel oil company and assume that they are a bad actor, but in actuality, you find is there's very good people trying to do good things. So what I discovered was that working with the pipeline company, I learned a boatload about rights of way, transmission with pipelines, but I also ended up working on a tremendous number of linear projects for utility companies to understand how they manage their corridors, which in retrospect, there's a tremendous number of rare, threatened, endangered species and unique habitats that occur in those corridors. And I learned a lot about protection, inventory, avoidance, how to, like, for instance, I learned from equipment operators how to restore wetlands. It's funny because there weren't many people in the 90s really focused on, if you're coming into a linear corridor and you're going to have to disturb land, how do you do an inventory up front, figure out what's there, and then have a realistic plan on how to avoid, minimize, and mitigate. And it turns out some of the equipment operators actually had a pretty good idea of how to take wetland soils, for instance, lay them aside, have good topo up front, do your work as quickly as you can, get back, and then lay your contours back, putting your hydric soils back on top and relying on the seed source and the root systems to really quickly reestablish themselves. So things like that were really powerful. And I think the importance of listening and talking to all players, because you find that there are people at every level. The most humble person you'll ever meet, a lot of these folks that work on the construction side, they're often not regarded as highly as other people, and they often are, maybe they aren't asked. I found along the way that the importance of asking and really taking the input and allowing other people to provide their perspectives, especially if they're working on the project, can really tremendously improve the collective knowledge of the team, but also really improve the outcomes. So that's something that I really learned early on. Hey, John, how's it going? I'm Charles. You want to go introduce yourself? We're kind of all just talking here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm John. I'm an undergraduate at Virginia Tech, studying ecological restoration. I will graduate this winter, so I'm excited to hear about some of the careers that you have to talk about in that field.
Cool.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you, man. Yeah, I was just talking a little bit about my transition into the field. And so I was just mentioning, while I was at graduate school at George Mason, I was working full time and learning along the way. The other thing I'll mention is that time frame I found. So ecological restoration ecology didn't exist. The earlier form was called landscape ecology. I was fortunate to have a professor named Fran Haliotis, who was Greek, who came from a European tradition and introduced to at least our graduate program the concept of landscape ecology, which has morphed into restoration ecology. And I don't know about you guys, but I am actually a systems person. I am a self-taught botanist. I have a research background in aquatic ecology, but I'm really a terrestrial systems person. And I think, like many people, sometimes we're jacks of all trades. I mean, some people are very specialized, but the key is, again, I've found being able to communicate with people, understanding and taking on a challenge. And also, how does your brain work? My brain tends to think systematically. So I'm more about how the components interact. How do you inventory a system to actually categorize what's there, what condition it's in, and then also begin to understand the stressors and understand what you may be able to do or not do to benefit that system. And that's something that I found over time is a pretty rare thing. There are not as many people as you would think that have the ability to really assess systems, do vegetative community classification, condition assessment, and be able to understand stressors, and then use that as a template to begin to think about what restoration looks like. And then the second piece of that is one of the things I do a lot of is community and stakeholder involvement. And you may think you know what you're talking about scientifically, but until you are able to communicate that to a stakeholder group and then listen to them in a way that makes them understand that you actually are listening and not just the person there telling them what you're going to do, that's what I've found is one of the most powerful tools, is being scientifically sound and making sure you're including as many experts as you can, but also that communication piece to talk to people has been one of the most important things in my career path. It's been helpful.
Charles, a question on that. I mean, I've been taking a lot of classes here at Tech, and it seems like to understand the natural world is so complex. I think ecology is one of the most complex disciplines if it's done well. I mean, and do you ever feel like you could get lost in the weeds, or it sounds like to me like you have a really good overview of how your restoration site works, but I also think that there's so many details, like the microbiology in the soil, all of the fauna interactions. It's just, I mean, to me, you could spend a lifetime understanding that. And how do you, it sounds like you feel confident enough though that you can affect restoration.
Yeah, I would say a couple things. Number one, take on challenges. So as you are given opportunities to take on new challenges, take them on. I mean, challenge yourself to learn. And I would also say remain incredibly humble. Never pretend to be what you're not. What you'll find is that you're always going to find people smarter than yourself. You're always going to find people who have an expertise in areas that you don't. And it's really important to network with them and be honest. What can you contribute to the process? And don't worry about your own limitations. We're all limited. Every one of us is limited in different ways. So just really work on improving your understanding and your skill sets, and focus on contributing in the best way you can within a process. And, I mentioned before, I've ended up being involved in oil spill recovery, and I don't have a clue about, biological processes with long chain carbon degradation. However, I learned about it, and my important thing was to understand the role it took in remediating soil profiles, because my job was not to be the expert. My job was to help characterize the conditions under which that was an applicable tool, and to work in the team to help apply the tool, and also to figure out the monitoring protocols to determine if it's successful. And again, you don't have to be the expert. You just need to be that person who gets the ideas, who contributes to the process, and who really is a team player in making sure that you have well-defined goals and then metrics for measuring those goals, and working together for good applied restoration, but also measuring the outcomes to determine if you're successful. Mm-hmm. So to me, I've always found that critically important.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. There's a few people that just joined, Emily, and I think Emily was it. Yeah. Could you unmute and introduce yourself, Emily?
Hi. My name is Emily. I'm a student here at Virginia Tech. Sorry, I joined a little bit late.
No worries.
I was having issues finding the QR code. Yeah, but I'm a biology student on the ecology track, and I was just wanting to join this to see what I could figure out for my future.
Cool. Great, Emily. And I was mentioning that, we were kind of talking about, I was talking a little bit about my career path, but I guess the whole point is I really want to be here as a resource for you guys. So the point of this hour is just to talk. And so we'll kind of keep going, I guess, but any questions you have or things you want the group to discuss, And the other thing I offered to both Pat and Leighton is I'm happy to remain a resource and interact with you guys. One of the things I was interested recently, I was fortunate every year. One of my colleagues I met years ago, who's a good friend of mine, he's retired and is one of the project leads for the Cape May raptor banding program, which is basically all volunteers. So one of the hardships I have in life is to spend a week every year in Cape May banding hawks and participating in their research program, and occasionally drinking really good New England IPAs from New Hampshire that other banders bring down. So that's what I did 2 weeks ago. And one of the coolest parts of that week was that the program intern for this year is a Virginia Tech graduate from the Wildlife Resources Program, Hannah, and I don't remember Hannah's last name off the top of my head, but very cool. And she's so she was up there, she's been up there all season, supporting that program, she's done a bunch of research internships and stuff. But it was really neat to see a great Virginia Tech graduate, and she is incredibly grounded in terms of her understanding of the biology, the research principles, the methodologies being employed, the ethics behind things. And then one night, we got to spend an evening with Nick Byer, who's a professor at Colby Sawyer College in New Hampshire, which is really cool liberal arts college. And one of his former students, came and helped out. And she had finished up an internship with the EPA and now has a full-time position with benefits with the EPA, doing stream work up in Maine, where she's working on characterizing analog streams. So basically reference conditions to help define what conditions constitute a good quality system. So you can use that in reference to, other systems that may be degraded, and figuring out restoration baseline, but also looking at from a permit perspective, how do you regulate degraded systems and have people restore them. So that was really cool. So that was another example where you had a recent graduate who had gone through an internship with EPA, and actually, she got a full-time benefit position and was doing really well. So it's cool to talk to her, both of them, and learn a bit more about the track they were on, And so I guess for me, I'm going to keep talking again. It's after I got my degree, I actually was secured a position with Fairfax County. So I've been fortunate to be, for the last 26 plus years, with one employer. But one of the things I found along the way is that I think I found this both within local government, in my case, and regional entities, and talking to people at the state, federal, levels, but also in private sector. It really is taking advantage of opportunities that arise. I mentioned before, when I was with Regional Park Authority, working on my graduate degree, we had a soil spill that occurred. So I was able to step in and learn a lot, contribute, and help with the remediation. But in addition, I learned at the time there were not many people who understood how to put together a restoration plan. And so at the time, it was in the 90s, mid 90s, a lot of the areas that we were restoring were areas that were treeless, essentially. So they were more meadow related areas or scrub shrub. So I reached out to Holiday Obrecht, who at the time was kind of the pioneer of creating bird-friendly habitat through U.S. Fish and Wildlife at Patuxent National Wildlife Refuge. And Holiday had written a bunch of papers on restoring habitat and power line rights of way and restoring meadows. So I networked with him. I networked with a bunch of other people, and just basically, back then, pre-internet, it's phone calls, letters, you're going to the library doing research, good old fashioned way. But the bottom line is, I think it really empowering to talk to people, but also realize at the time there was, and I think this is still very true, and I'll share that shortly, that there is still an infancy when it comes to restoration. There are tremendous gaps. Nobody knows it all. Nobody can tell you the answers to everything. You're going to have to network and figure it out, and piece this stuff together. And the key thing, I think, is you try really hard, but you're not always going to succeed. So you have to be willing to be, again, rigorous, take notes, get your principles down, put together the best plan you can, bounce it off other people, but also be adaptive, because you're not going to be right all the time. And some things simply aren't going to work. And maybe it's because of something you couldn't anticipate. But the bottom line is that was a helpful thing for me in the 90s, talking to different people, because there weren't many people doing that work at the time. And I had to learn on my own. So I started putting together protocols. And what's weird is within several years, people start asking you questions as if you know what you're talking about. And that's really dangerous because you have to, the best thing you can do is be humble and say, hey, I've tried this and it's kind of worked, or I tried this and it didn't work. But I will tell you, I'm not an expert in this, but here's the things I do know. But I think that's really important, is that we really do need to continue to rely on each other and network and talk to people to make sure we're rigorous in what we're doing. And when it works, share it. When it doesn't work, share it. Talk again, network, so that we can collaboratively build on our experiences and utilize each other's resources to continue to grow. I will say too, early on, back again years ago, people did not value enough soils, and I have become a tremendous proponent of understanding soil science and understanding that compromised soil profiles are one of our greatest enemies, and one of the greatest challenges of restoration is to restore soil profiles. And one of my personal beliefs, and this is actually going back to, I don't know if you may remember E.O. Wilson, who died about 4 years ago, one of the seminal minds in biology and ecology in the 20th century and early 21st century. And he came up with the concept of half Earth, which supports the concept of, it's the trillion trees effort. We need to restore, according to the UN, somewhere around 30% of habitable terrestrial Earth to systems that support biological processes, including biodiversity, ecosystem services. E.O. Wilson thought it was more like 50% of habitable Earth, terrestrial Earth. But what I've come to understand, for me, in the restoration work I've done, is that soils are the hardest thing to overcome. We certainly suffer from many problems, and those include plant material sources, seeds, finding enough good quality local plant stock, making sure we're focusing on locally common plant species. But the soil profiles are one of the things that has been least looked at. And most of the planting I have both participated in, observed, and collaborated with suffered from a great lack of understanding of the importance of soils. And so one of the things I've really been fortunate with, and I'm talking to Leighton a couple of years ago, and one of my colleagues, Megan Fellows, now works in Delaware, we began to use applied nucleation on our projects in Fairfax County, and are now collaborating with a team in Harford County, Maryland. And I've talked to a bunch of foresters. I've served on forestry groups and talked to folks on restoration planting, doing buffer plantings. And I think I'm really kind of surprised, but I'm not surprised, that you have a lot of traditional foresters who do not seem to understand that planting in a plantation style planting in degraded soil profiles will not get you much for decades. That you can look at decades old plantings that have terrible soil profiles, and yet you can look at a 5 or 6 year old nucleated planting and already begin to see the accumulation of leaf litter and other things that are suppressing invasives, and begin to see what appears to be improving soil profiles. And actually, again, I'll give a big nod to Leighton. My colleague Megan and her husband, who's actually Greg Noe, he's a leading sediment researcher for USGS, are completing a study that they've done on some of our nucleated planting sites. They did the field work in the last couple of months. They'll probably be publishing a paper next year on the benefits, what they found in terms of the soil profiles inside these nucleated plots, as well as the vegetative condition. and the exterior to those within the areas that were planted on plantation style planting. So I'm bringing this up because this is truly an emerging field. And I think, like everything else in our field, we need to continue to be open and very humble and continue to learn, because we have to continue to learn. We have so much work to do, and there's so few of us. And we have to learn from each other, put as much good stuff in the ground as possible. And I've also, I know I'm kind of going over now, but I have some ideas that I've been pondering over the last year or so about things we need to consider in our work going forward. We tend to get very stovepiped, focused on the things that we're doing, which is important. You have to be focused on your work, but we also have to have this larger cognizance. Like Theo, you were talking about the real focus on restoring, I believe, like within agricultural lands, and how do we use that as a major stepping stone. And in my opinion, that's hugely important. The regenerative agriculture has been out there as a concept and somewhat of a practice for quite a few years, but I think less than 5% of our agriculture is regenerative. And it's not just restoring areas that are not for human use, it's also making the areas that are dedicated for human benefit to be more friendly ecologically, to reduce their carbon footprint, to increase their carbon sequestration, and to make them more friendly towards biodiversity. I know, Leighton, we talked about the Bee Friendly Beef program as one example of that. There's a couple of others. So I think thinking inside the context of restoring things that are not, that hopefully long term will be dedicated to the benefit of overall biodiversity and climate resilience, but also even within human dominated landscapes, converting them to be much more friendly to biodiversity overall, and also to carbon sequestration and ecosystem services. So I kind of think of it three ways. One is we need to identify and restore lands on a massive scale that are primarily not for human use. And that is the kind of the core of the idea of ecological restoration. How do we harness those principles? We also need to then take the agricultural side and convert as much of that as possible to regenerative agriculture, in order to reduce the impact, reduce the resource inputs, the runoff effects, the chemical inputs, things like that, and the water use. And then we need to take the built landscapes, and we need to actually reintroduce locally native plants to our built landscapes. And I've been working on that with Audubon, Virginia Plant Society for years, trying to promote people planting locally common native plant species. And I will suggest that all biodiversity is local. It really is so focused on local plant systems. So and I'm sounding very preachy, I realize, on and on and on. So I'm gonna be careful not to do too much of that. So anyway, I've kind of had that my mind. I've been working on this three-pronged approach to thoughts on what to do going forward. I'm sorry, was there a question or a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to mention, you mentioned the dearth of soils expertise. I just went through, and I'm not going to name names or anything, but I just went through the Chesapeake Bay landscape professional program. It's relatively lightweight program, but very good. But I was interested in they call them BMPs, the bioretention areas. What's when the the runoff from parking lots and around the bioretention area, when it gets there, I was asking what happens next. I mean, is it degraded, broken down, turned into something less toxic? And there was very few people. Hey, thanks, Leighton. He had to take off. But so I guess that's an example of again, lack of soil expertise. So I'm going to try to investigate that myself a little more.
Well, I will say that actually there has been work on that on different fronts. So thinking about, and I will throw this out, that if you are working in any area, it's really good to periodically investigate whether or not what your practice is working. So, and I apologize, my brain is not functioning 100% right now, but there's actually a professor from Virginia Tech who's working with Fairfax County to look at tree planting boxes, which are used often for BMPs in urban areas. And it
Okay.
is, I'll think of it after this, and he's really well known, very well respected. Anyway, the thought is to look at the actual composition of the soils, determine whether or not they're supportive of the plants that are in them, and B, whether or not they have the composition they're supposed to have in order to provide the treatment benefit they have. So there are really important studies to be undertaken to make sure what's actually specified, A, works if it's done correctly, or B, is it being done correctly? And if not, how do you improve that process? And that's the other thing is we can have all the ideas we want in the world, but who's putting them in the ground and who's watching them and who's verifying whether or not they're being done correctly, whether or not they work. All that is important. Whether it's in an urban system like that, where you're doing an applied method for stormwater benefits, or whether it's in a rural system even, and if the methods they're using are working properly. So I think it's really important. Hey, by the way, I want to throw something out there. Again, Theo, I know you mentioned specifically thinking about restoration of, I think you even mentioned maybe degraded sites like industrial sites is one of the thoughts. Well, let me just share that I went to a conference about a year ago. I presented at a conference in Richmond, and one of the other presenters was from the University of Kentucky, and they have a program. There are 1 million acres in Appalachia of strip mine degraded land. There's a huge backlog of restoration in Appalachia for these strip mine sites. So basically, these were surface mines where they completely trashed the ecosystem and graded off the top layer to get at the whatever they're mining, often coal, and then left behind often a pretty degraded condition. So the University of Kentucky has a good, very well established program. So if you're interested in that and looking at restoration of mining sites and degraded surface areas, highly degraded, and I think it would also be applicable to some degree to farmlands. University of Kentucky is a very good resource, and they have a program that's been very successfully funded, apparently for at least 10 years or more, maybe at least 15 years. So that might be a good site to look at, and also their methods in terms of what they're doing.
By the way, is there, I mean, 1 million acres, is there funding, a funding stream to do the restoration there, do you think? Or
Yeah, I think the key is I don't know all the funding streams. They indicate that the presenters worked for the University of Kentucky. He indicated there was some good federal funding, and I think with some of the recent, like the Infrastructure Act, there is a lot more, because one of the other things it does is it has an eye on whether or not, if you restore the land properly, will it provide a local economic resource in the future? Now, I have mixed emotions about it, because I don't want it to be a place where they come in and clear cut in the future, but can you work within the context of a group to put the appropriate management plan in place that says it may have a beneficial use over time once it reaches certain metrics, and how can you measure? Is it have certain, soil recovery? Is it supporting certain species? Does it have age class diversity within your plant community? And could you potentially selectively harvest, for instance, in a way that still promotes continued, habitat support for different species? So I think that's the kind of thing that's really important when you're thinking about taking a restored site and figuring out whether or not in the future it could become a beneficial use site.
okay. If anyone has any particular questions and wants to jump in, feel free. So
Yeah, this idea of like regenerating soil profiles is pretty new to me, and like you said, it's not something that's really talked about that much in restoration. I mean, what I have learned about soil genesis is that it takes tens to thousands of years for these soil forming processes to occur. So how do you quantify soil profile regeneration in a restoration project?
That's an excellent question. And I think it's funny because I think you guys are educated, and I'm not saying that to be um, dismissive of other people, but there's a lot of lay people who ask the same question in the sense that, well, why should I even try, kind of thing. I think the irony is that in terms of being a very highly developed soil profile, that does indeed take very long periods of time. However, you can restore a lot of the soil function in relatively short periods of time with the right treatments, and it's highly variable. I will say a couple things about that too. You have to learn to pick your battles. It depends on what your goals are. There are some sites, the soils are hammered, you have very high invasive species propagule density, meaning you have a lot of invasives around your site, high seed source. What is your goal? Can you achieve your goal on that site? And I've talked to people who I believe may have selected a wrong site with the wrong goals and will beat their heads against the wall and not necessarily be successful. So I would suggest that think about your site and think about your goals. One of the things I've observed, and this is what's actually pretty cool to me, over decades, I've watched sites that had volunteer native flora reestablish stable soil profiles. They're not perfect. You can look along roadsides, vacant lots, old farm fields, cemeteries. Those are the kind of places I've looked at. And what I found is that you have species like broom sedge, eastern red cedar, Virginia pine. They're pioneer species that are really tough. They tend to have high propagule density, so there's a lot of them are out there. They'll seed themselves into the site, and often over time, they'll establish very stable profiles, and they're pioneer species that begin to rebuild the soil. So one of the things to think about is, what's your time frame for restoration? It may be you need 20 years of pioneer species doing all the biological engineering of the soil profile, put carbon back in to reestablish the right microbiology. And that's another thing. So if you want to move from a meadow system where it's arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi to a forest system with ectomycorrhizal fungi, you'll need to slowly introduce your woodies. And again, we mentioned before that Leighton's been pioneering the nucleated planting. If you want to reintroduce your woodies, I highly recommend you look at nucleated planting. You establish those nodes where the woodies begin to recruit the spores of the ectomycorrhizal fungi, which are in the air. You don't need to inoculate the soil. There's been very good research. If you have within miles, have some intact fragments of the type of community you want to eventually build, that spore is in the air, man. You don't need to pay for it. You just need to create the opportunity to recruit it so that those woody plants and those nodes essentially recruit from the air the spores. They give them the symbiotic community ability to build increasing fungal density, and that is what will restore over time. And again, now I'm talking about many decades potentially. I listened to a great talk the other day. It's actually on the 10% Happier podcast, which is by Dan Harris. There's a lady named Krista Tippett, and they mentioned the fact that you need to accept that the goals that you have for a project may not occur in your lifetime. And I know that's humbling for all of us. We want things to succeed and be able to measure it, see it, and be able to stake our flag in it. But I think when we're talking ecology, there's often times when the recovery of the system takes a lot of patience, and you need to recruit people and say that, I'll do it as long as I can, recruit more people to take on that cause and keep going with it, because it might take longer than you have. But I think, John, your question's ideal in the sense that we can restore soil profiles. It's just that, and I do agree that if you want it to look like some pristine primeval forest, it ain't going to happen in your lifetime, period. However, you can begin to restore the all the biotics that need to rebuild that soil. Just think about being sequential and how you do it and what your kind of your first steps. Tess Thompson, who's actually at Virginia Tech, she's actually developed a soil profile rebuilding protocol, which we've used in a couple projects. And it's very intensive, where you actually introduce organics, use heavy equipment to turn the soil over down to like 24 inches. That's very intensive. I think it has application in certain conditions, but it's overkill and outside the resource capability of a lot of projects. We've also used deep soil tine ripping, and that's much cheaper and can be done. But again, if there's tree roots present, you can't really do it as much. And tilling. So I think there's all these gradations of how, whether or not you disturb the soil profile and to what degree. I've also listened to a couple talks by, there's a guy, and I can't remember his name, I apologize, but he works for Davy Tree. He's really cool. He's actually lives in Virginia also, but he goes all over the country and he consults on doing restoration and tree planting. And he referenced some really good research that said simply by coming in and mulching on the surface and resting that soil profile, the microbes that are there over time will begin to incorporate that carbon, and it will fluff the soil up and they'll reduce the compaction without any direct intervention. So again, thinking about processes that made work, that are cheap, but they require some patience and they require some timing in terms of multiple interventions over time. And what, by the way, another thing is I've done a lot of work on grasslands, and I'll say flat out, grasses are our friends. If you can get local native warm season grasses established as a first phase of restoration, grasses put more carbon in the soil than woody plants do, because they simply just pump carbon into their root systems and they fluff it up over time. They're amazing at what they can do. So you can use them as an early phase restoration method to reintroduce carbon and begin to decompact the soil, along with things like eastern red cedar in our instance, or maybe wherever you are, there's another plant, and then begin to slowly reintroduce those later succession species and nodes. So that's a long discussion, but it's a topic, John. I'm with you, man. It's an area of incredible importance for understanding restoration potential in terrestrial systems.
You ever, does anyone ever actually introduce the spores of I know there's this in my soil microbiology class, Dr. Mark Williams was talking about a source for getting spores.
Sure. And there are companies that do inoculation, like they'll sell you a spore or whatever, kind of a package. And I'm not going to pretend that I understand fully the extent to which that might be beneficial in some cases. But I will say that there have been good research papers to say that you can recruit your spore from the air, that restoration sites where it's properly planned, they can, that spores in the air. So you can recruit your local fungal, in this case, what you're looking with woodies is ectomycorrhizal fungi. And it's out there. It's floating around the air. You're breathing it, matter of fact. Anytime you're walking near any woody plant area, you're breathing ectomycorrhizal fungal spore. And other times of the year, you're breathing arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal spore from herbaceous indoor stands that have like maple and walnut and things like that. So it's out there. But yeah, there definitely are folks who are increasingly looking at producing spore inoculation. They will sell you to put in the soil. But yeah, just look more into it for your project and figure out whether or not that you need that, or whether or not you can just let it happen.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a sidetrack here, but what amazed me was, and I don't know much about farming, but we were test planting corn, seeds, kernels, or whatever, and they came with a coating, a red coating of fungicide, and you know, the idea is to eliminate damaging, you know, I guess, soil fungi, but it's so totally, obviously it interferes with natural benefits from mycorrhizal stuff, but it's like,
Yeah. Well, I will not get on a soapbox here. I will say that I have a great lack of knowledge on ag science. However, what I do understand is that's, corn is a great example of a crop that has been not only have the GMO corn that is also ready for herbicides, particularly from Monsanto. You have to buy your corn seed from them, and the intent is to create a annual crop that is highly dependent upon petrochemical inputs, both in terms of chemicals for fertilizers, chemicals for herbicides, water, you name it. And so I would suggest that although, yes, it's important to have that capability, that's where regenerative agriculture is looking at ways of using no-till and much less intensively engineered plant resources. And there's some early evidence to say that they're very successful when it's done right, with lower resource inputs and lower overall ecological impact. So
interesting.
Again, area of great need. So if that's a passion for you guys, man, go for it. That's something we need. So we need better understanding of how we grow the food we eat that keeps us alive and how we interact with the land on which we do it.
Yeah, we just watched a video on Polyface Farm. I don't know whether you're familiar with
it's
down there, Stanton.
Yeah, Noel Gelatin. I've heard him speak before, and one of the things I'll say is he is apparently, he's one of the pioneers of doing organic, like free range, but my understanding of his site is it's biologically dead. You're not supporting native plants, you're not supporting native insects, you're not supporting native bird species. You need to convert these spaces to not being European and Asian plants that are solely turned over to our livestock. And that's my perspective, but I think there's a lot of good evidence that's true. So although I know I could learn a lot from folks who have done this successfully for years, I also would turn around and challenge them to, like the Beef Friendly Beef program, which Leighton has participated in, is where you're trying to reintroduce native plants into pasturage. So you don't just have European grasses and forbs that your cattle are eating. Why not put in native plants so that you could actually support native insects in addition? And maybe it's not 100% native, but you at least have crossover space where you're supporting other organisms and not just intensively raising beef. So yes, I think there's great value to things like Polyface Farm, but I will also challenge them. And also there's other people who've promoted switchgrass in huge, in Virginia, we should not be growing switchgrass in the Peabody Mountains, period. It creates biologically diminished pasturage, and you're using mostly Midwestern switchgrass and big bluestem, which is biologically diminishing. So look at your analogs. And that's what, again, I know you through Virginia Tech and also through the Clifton Institute, they've done tremendous research on what our actual native meadows look like. And they have great species templates. And one of the graduate students from your program actually helped do that work. She helped define like what those communities look like, what the species templates look like, and it ain't switchgrass and it ain't big bluestem. So anyway, that's one of my soapbox issues too, is people get hung up on promoting species that aren't necessarily consistent with what's out there ecologically.
Right.
So I think we bored Theo, Joseph, and Emily to death. Is there anything, come on, join the discussion, and what can we talk about?
Sorry if you're repeating yourself. I might have missed it at the beginning of the talk, but where do you work?
I work with Fairfax County. I have for 26 years. My background, starting with undergrad, well, I left the military, came into public sector, but also have worked for nonprofits as both a volunteer, mostly as a volunteer and as a board member for many years. So, but I've worked managing public lands most of my career, and that's up to the largest system I managed was 23,000 acres. Really diverse. We instituted a urban burn program, so using prescribed burning, managed meadows, buffer restoration, reforestation, massive invasive control, and also have spent a lot of time doing wildlife population control, especially deer management, to try to recover mostly forested ecosystems.
Very interesting.
And then riparian corridor restoration has been a big focus over the last 10 years.
So I mean, in all of our classes in school, we talk about the kind of academic sector of restoration. We talk about the experimentation and earlier you were talking about how important it is for us to continue to learn and to share knowledge, and I couldn't agree more. So I'm curious to what level the private sector or just in restoration industry in general outside of academia, like to what level do y'all document and make your projects like into experiments or publish the information from those experiments? I don't know if I asked that in a clear way or not.
No, that's really good. I would say a couple things. Number one, it's very compartmentalized. I would say within forestry, is a wide range of different focuses. There's clearly a heavy silviculture focus that's dominant in Virginia. They're planting pine plantation and harvesting pine for wood products. And I'm not dissing that. I'm just suggesting that we need to be more cognizant of where we're planting low biological diversity systems and what benefit that has over time. I also have seen urban foresters who are very focused on equity issues, and increasingly they're looking at the social impacts of trees and how they benefit things. Then you've got folks who really are doing the science side. So ecological forestry, ecological silviculture, looking at how you manage systems to, and Theo, thanks for coming in, how you manage systems to benefit not only the silviculture side, but also biology. And there's actually nationally, there's a big focus on that. So I'd say on the forestry side, there's a better conversation occurring. I'd say has a long way to go because not everybody's getting that message. And there's a lot of beat up land out there that people are still doing crappy things on without a lot of informed process. So that's one. On the aquatic ecology side, I've been fortunate for more than 20 years to work with really good aquatic ecologists, and their job has been to document the condition. They're not applied ecologists, so they have very good scientific background, understanding and knowledge about trends, impacts, and the data and the statistical analysis to understand what's going on in streams, usually in association to the land use, what's draining to it. So there's a rigorous area of science there, but most of that's not applied. Most of that is more in the traditional science where it is a monitoring system, program. I know that for me, working in public sector, I was fortunate to work in a reasonably well-funded program where we did do some good work. Again, I was managing about 23,000 acres. We were able to implement some programs. It required a lot of push because you are often pulled into really crappy systems where it's degraded and you're required to work on things that are more publicly popular, and that's a consistent thing. And then for me in the public sector, again, working on riparian corridor restoration, there's been a lot of work out there that has damaged ecosystems. And I will say that there is a push, but is a long way to go to having enough expertise that's not they aren't engineers that really understand system, assessing systems and doing restoration design and implementation and monitoring to ensure it's actually happening. So then in the private sector, it really is hit or miss. It depends on the client. And for many years, I've talked with colleagues in the private sector. They work for clients who are developers, and they're kind of documenting destruction. But sometimes they're working for clients who are really focused on solving problems, implementing good stuff. So I think there is opportunity out there for sure. And I'm very hopeful that as we change kind of the lens, like with the big investment dollars in the Infrastructure Act now, that some of those programs will be much more focused on restoring ecosystems, ecosystem function, and having measurable outcomes. And that is a great basis, and plus groups that slowly become more attuned to the need to have support biodiversity and restore ecosystem function. I think there's opportunity there too.
This is kind of a personal question, but maybe others would be interested. Being a Fairfax County resident for decades, it's been disappointing to see nature kind of disappear.
Yeah.
And but I understand where you're coming from. We have to have a built environment that also includes things that support diversity. So I'm just wondering your take on that. I mean, working in that area, do you feel disappointed yourself, frustrated? Do you see hope there?
Well, it's funny because I lived my entire time, 29 years of my time working in that area. I lived in Prince William County. And for 14 of that, I lived in a forested area on well and septic. And in the last several years, I've moved south. So I've actually lived in Spotsylvania County on about 5.5 acres, where I had red bats flying this afternoon next to my house. It was above 50 degrees. So they were out foraging. So at the same time, I hear what you're saying, Pat. And I don't know if y'all are familiar with Earth Sangha. They're one of the premier, they're a nonprofit based out of Fairfax that is a family-run nonprofit that collects local seed and propagates plants. And they are the most unique. There are other native plant suppliers out there, but I've never found a more ethical, and Joseph, thanks for coming in, group. And, I've heard even from folks like one of the founders of that group, just being discouraged over the last however many years, saying, hey, well, all this stuff's disappearing. All I got to say is, I grew up as a kid playing in urban systems in Arlington. So I was thrilled to find nature wherever I could. And I just got to say, we're alive, man. We have to appreciate what we can, do the best we can, and realize we are always going to be successful, and don't get too discouraged, because life is life and we have the time we have. So, I mean, I'm not trying to downplay it, but it's true. We have to find the joy where we can, have as much success as we can, and not get too discouraged by the fact that we can't control everything.
Yeah, I've started to realize lately that we have to think about how far we've come also, like compared to the 1800s, the beginning of industrialization. Like, we have come a long way, and I think we have the potential to do more, but I don't know, we do what we can.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like, hope has to overcome our experience or something. So, okay, we're about an hour into this. Any other discussion people want to do? We have probably a few more minutes, if we do.
Let me throw something out to both of you. It's cool because I mentioned I was up in Cape May, and I was able to interact with some folks that recent college graduates and folks who've been in the field for a while and older folks. And one of the things I'm really encouraged by is we really need to get over, roles, like who, we need to interact with each other and be collaborative as hell and recruit people from all different walks, age groups, you name it. Everybody's willing to pitch in, get them to pitch in, and also make them put their money where their mouth is. And I've done that in projects where I said, people want to come in and complain, or they want to say this or that. Well, okay, pick up the shovel kind of thing. It's be an active participant for the solution, not just calling out what you think is the problem, but also recruiting people again of all age groups, backgrounds, whatever, because everybody has a stake in it. We all have a stake in it,
Yeah. Totally agree there.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to blow my own horn, but I mean, as a retiree, I could sit around and enjoy my life, so to speak, but I wanted to go back in and try to do some good. So maybe I will. But I also, people like John, the forecast for what's going to happen to the planet is, I feel like I won't be around for that, but you guys will.
Well,
yeah, it's going to be quite, I don't know if exciting is the right word. Full of action, we'll say that.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I'm curious. I don't know if this is the right question for you, Charles, or not, but so our major aligns with SER,
yep.
And so upon graduation, we're able to test out and get our CERP.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you know anything about that process. I know that that's kind of a new thing for SER to have their curriculum line up with university curriculums. So I was just curious if you knew about like what my steps will be to go from graduating to getting my CERP.
Yeah, I would look at the curriculum requirements. So I'm a CERP, and I was because I'm an old, I have like old curriculum, old whatever. I remember going through the process within the last 5 years. I'm in the recertification process right now because it's every year, every 5 years you have to re-up. And it was really interesting to look at what the requirements were and trying to translate my coursework from decades ago, as well as my experience, into the CERP program. So I would go for it, man. I would go for it, get the CERP, and then think about what you want. And again, another thing, I find great value. I'm serving on 2 committees right now, one board and 1 committee for SER. I find great value and great promise, and we need more of us. We really need more of us. On the other hand, we have to challenge the organization to do for us. So make sure it's working for you. Make sure it's providing you the benefits you need, and challenge your fellow SER members to do that. Because if it doesn't, then what the hell good is it? So I'm in, I'm a CERP, I'm recertifying, I'm volunteering for groups, but I also realize we have to produce. So I would encourage you to go for it. And I think it's a good way to go. We need a lot of us. So we need more and more people to pitch in. That's helpful.
Is it just a test that you take?
No, it's all about curriculum. So you look at your educational background, your experience, you write, you get a couple people to write you different. I know on the CERP side, and I've done it for a couple other people too, to write letters of recommendation so that they can see you've got this background, you're working on these things, you've got support from colleagues, kind of thing. They kind of want to see the spectrum of things within the process. But have you checked out the requirements for it?
Hey, can I jump in here real quick? Which is that I wasn't sure I wanted a full degree, and so up until last year, I was focusing on CERP requirements and carefully staying in contact with the guy at SER to make sure I was on track and everything. Although they drove me crazy because the thing is, it's reviewed by a committee, okay, and they don't want to say in advance that if you take this class, this committee is going to accept it. They want to keep some leverage with the committee. But anyway, so I did get the I focused on, it's about 60 credits for Serpent, and Charles is right. You get some letters of recommendation. They do some pretty lightweight online training, and I did get it, and so I'm now a Serpent, and yeah. But and then again, if you get a degree, it comes, I think you still have to go through the process, but they pretty much say if you have your eco restoration degree at Tech, you're also going to be a Serpent, so
Okay.
the one question I have to Charles, and you sort of alluded to this, is that, and by the way, I talked to Megan Fellows about this also. I think the idea behind this is to professionalize restoration, standardize it, professionalize it. I mean, give some gravitas to it, or whatever, equivalent to like engineers. I mean, I was just happened to, my dad was a professional engineer, and I mean, they had in the Virginia Code, they have requirements to be an engineer, and I'm like, wouldn't that be great in the Virginia Code if they had requirements for eco restoration? But anyway, I get that. Again, that was my impression, is that it's a relatively new field, and that SER was trying to professionalize it.
Yes.
Okay.
It's not probably the best parallel is the certified wetland professionals. So that's a certification that's used regularly to do wetland delineations and have them accepted by the Corps of Engineers for any land disturbing activity. So you pretty much need a certified wetland professional in order to get your permit. And we're not near that with the Serpent side of things. But the standards-based restoration, I will tell you flat out, I mean, sadly enough, it's probably the most important thing that the earth needs, but it's also the least understood and emphasized. And, it's funny, I'm on the Lears board now, and there are some great people in other countries doing cool shit, but there's not a lot of it. So I think that's one of the focuses. We tremendously need to increase the amount of restoration that's going on and support everybody who's doing that work. And, and hopefully over time, improve the credential aspect, so at least people have a common language and are using common standards. I think it's really important. I really do. So I'm with you guys. Like, we could all in 10 years say, screw SER, they're not doing shit for us, and walk away, just drop the mic. At the same time, the only group out there doing it. And it's up to us. It's our organization. We either want it to work or we don't want it to work. So it's up to us to make it work. And I think that's the kind of the important part, is get on the inside and agitate, make it work.
Yeah.
So
they were actually looking for, and I meant to sign up. They were looking for people to, they weren't looking for people for the review committee, but for some other activity that they needed for SERP. So
if you want to do it, man, I'm serious. I went on to the marketing and outreach committee without any, it's like, I'll volunteer and get my feet wet. So I've been doing that until I met Leighton. And then now I'm on the Lears board, and I will say that we have a lot of work to do on the Lears board. We have a heavy lift ahead of us, but I would say it's worth it. We need everybody to pitch in. So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Greatly appreciate this, Charles. And like I said, we'll put the recording out there, and if you want to forward materials, we can share those also.
Sure.
With the
And
group.
both
please keep
John and Pat, both of you guys, and I'm happy to help out and if we want to have another conversation at some point, I'm happy to pitch in. And it's good. It's good to network and support each other and pitch in whatever way we can.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was good to see you, Pat, and it was nice to meet you, Charles.
John, good to meet you, man. Yeah, Pat,
go
good to see you.
Yeah.
All right.
Rest of your night.
All right, guys.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Take it easy. Bye.